The cold wind cut through Marcus's jacket as he pedaled, his legs sore from the constant strain. The bike's tires hummed against the pavement, the rain-soaked cardboard boxes in his baskets shifting with every jolt, sending an occasional sting through his fingertips as he gripped the handles. He didn't look up much anymore. People who never quite looked at him, who passed by with eyes that seemed to see right through him. It was with something else, something sharp, like the words they sometimes shouted at him when they thought he couldn't hear. It always stung. He never did. It was hard to breathe sometimes. The constant exhaustion was there, too, and the familiar taste of something bitter at the back of his throat. The tight grip of time on him was a constant, a cruel taskmaster. No greeting from the customers, just the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen, mixed with the faint odor of something old. He could hear the murmurs of voices through the thin walls, their words too muffled to catch. As he rang the doorbell, he prepared himself. When the door opened, the man didn't even look him in the eye. The sound echoed, and Marcus was left standing alone on the stoop. The world was so indifferent. A voice inside him whispered, "You are somebody." But there was always that gnawing doubt. It would never be different. It wasn't just the weather, another delivery, another house. But this was his life, so he kept pedaling. The pavement, still damp from the rain earlier, reflected a harsh, uneven glow that made it harder to see the cracks in the road. The bike bounced with every bump, and Marcus bit his lip, pushing through it. He didn't have time to think. The address was on the corner of a busy street. He didn't know if he had ever seen the people living inside, but he didn't care. He just needed to drop off the package and keep moving. A woman answered, her expression immediately cold. Marcus handed it over, careful not to look directly at her face. "Thank you," she said. Her tone clipped, and then, without even waiting for him to respond, she stepped back, pulling the door closed in one swift motion. He didn't flinch. He had learned a long time ago not to react, not to show how much it hurt, how deeply it stung every time. Marcus stood there for a moment, trying to steady his breath, but the sting of humiliation refused to fade. There was no time for feelings, no time for questions. He didn't hear the soft laughter from the sidewalk or the whispers of children watching him ride by. It was always like this. But he did. He cared about the small things, the gestures people didn't even realize they made. But he was too tired to care today. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk as Marcus pedaled through the streets. His legs burned with each rotation of the pedals, and his back ached in a way that made him want to stop, but stopping wasn't an option. He had 3 more deliveries to make before the shift was over, but something about the day felt heavier than usual. It was always like this, but today it felt different. The next house was on a quiet street, tucked away from the main road. Marcus slowed as he approached, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The silence felt strange, unnatural. He reached the door and knocked, the sound echoing in the silence. "Delivery," Marcus said, holding out the package. "Thanks," he muttered, not looking Marcus in the eye. Marcus stood there for a moment, his hand still resting where the package had been. It never did. The world had a way of swallowing you up, piece by piece. Every day felt like a battle, one he didn't always know how to fight. But it didn't work, and no matter how fast he went, it was always there, following him, pressing in on him from all sides. The wind hit him in the face again, a sharp sting that made his eyes water. His legs ached, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his chest, the ache of living, in a world that never seemed to care about him. The building was old, the walls cracked and faded, a far cry from the polished, pristine buildings in the richer parts of town. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He knocked lightly, but no one answered. A woman appeared in the doorway, her face blank, eyes barely meeting his. Marcus nodded, handing it over. Another door slammed, another invisible wound. He turned and walked back. Down the stairs, his heart heavy, his steps slow, and there was no relief. No one to understand. The bills had to be paid. There was no time for a breakdown, not in a life that demanded too much and offered too little in return. The streets had begun to quiet down. the hum of the city shifting into the occasional sound of a car passing by, or the faint laughter of people gathered on porches. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting an orange hue over the concrete, but it did little to soften the cold knot in his stomach. His final delivery for the day was a short ride away, but every pedal felt like it weighed twice as much. The bike creaked under his weight, the worn-out tires struggling to keep him steady. The lights inside were dim, but he could make out the shadow of a figure moving behind the curtains. It took a moment, and then the door creaked open. His eyes flickered over Marcus, but he didn't smile. Just reached for the package, grabbed it, and shut the door without another glance. It wasn't a surprise, but that didn't make it easier. He had learned to carry this weight, to bury it deep inside. He climbed back onto his bike, and as he did, something inside him snapped. It was quiet, just a subtle shift, a small breaking point that he couldn't ignore any longer. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional, spiritual. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the urge to stop the bike, stop the ride, stop the whole damn thing. Instead, he pedaled away from the house down the darkening street, his mind racing. People didn't have to say it out loud, but in the silence, Marcus could hear it, the constant hum of loneliness, the oppressive weight of feeling invisible. He felt the ache in his legs, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his soul. It never would be. But he didn't have the luxury of being angry, of being frustrated. He had to keep moving. For what? He pulled up to the last block before the final stretch, to his apartment. But the thought of going home, of sitting in the small dimly lit room he called home, didn't bring any comfort. There was a faint sound of sirens in the distance, the city never truly sleeping, always moving, always alive. The world was big, and he was small. It was a cycle he didn't know how to break, just a tiny shift, like a shift in the wind that couldn't be ignored. It was still. The air had turned cooler as Marcus made his way home, the night settling in around him like a blanket of isolation. His mind had become a dull echo of his surroundings, a place where the weight of every insult, every rejection, piled up in heavy silence. As he reached the corner of his block, he saw the familiar stretch of cracked sidewalks, the dim glow of a street lamp in the distance, the comfort of knowing where the pain would come next. He dragged his bike up the stairs, the familiar creak of the building echoing in the empty corridor. The silence inside was heavy, thick with the weight of a day spent battling invisible forces. He didn't want to think, but the thoughts came anyway, those quiet, nagging doubts that crept in when there was nothing else to distract him. Just a delivery guy. The world outside had never bothered to notice him. Marcus turned over, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him. He was exhausted in ways he couldn't explain. He could feel it then, the heaviness of rejection seeping into his skin, into his bones. But tonight it was harder than ever. But the thought of food felt distant, insignificant. Just as he closed his eyes, hoping to escape into a restless sleep, something shifted. He could feel a presence in the room with him, though he didn't know why. It was as if something or someone was standing beside him. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was different. And then, in the stillness, he heard a voice. It wasn't a voice he had ever heard before, but it felt familiar, like something he had been searching for without even knowing it. You don't have to. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he didn't move. He felt a warmth in his chest, like the pressure on his heart was slowly being lifted. The presence was still there, lingering, but it didn't rush him. It was simply offering something. Marcus sat there in silence, his heart racing. He didn't know who or what this was, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. The voice he had heard, so soft, so gentle, was fading, but the warmth it left behind lingered. His heart was still racing, but it wasn't the same kind of fear he was used to. This was different, quieter, more comforting. He glanced at the clock, 2:14 a.m. He hadn't even realized how long he had been lying there, lost in the silence. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long felt just a little lighter, and for the first time in a long time, He allowed himself to sit with it. He wasn't as numb as he had been before. It wasn't the bone-deep weariness that came from endless days of labor, of being unseen and unheard. He wasn't sure if he believed in moments like this, but now, he wasn't sure what it was, but he could feel it. Something bigger, something more profound than anything he had ever known. He imagined what it might feel like to be seen, truly seen. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just another face in the crowd, another worker pushing through the grind. He didn't know how long he stayed there, but when he opened his eyes again, the world outside hadn't changed. The city was still asleep, wrapped in its own indifference. The quiet was still there, but the loneliness didn't feel as suffocating. He got up from the bed and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. But for him, in this moment, it was okay. He was still fighting, still moving forward. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He would ride his bike, make his deliveries, face the same slights, the same prejudices, a whisper, a warmth, a feeling of peace. Marcus woke to the soft hum of the world outside his window, the sound of the city still moving while he stayed behind in the silence of his small room. He had barely slept, his mind too restless. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the heaviness he had carried for so long. His legs still ached from the day before, the usual pain of a delivery man's life. But there was a subtle difference today. His eyes lingered on the small clock by his bedside. Not today. His body was worn from the work, but there was something in him that felt different. He shuffled to the small kitchen, the light from the window casting a pale glow on the chipped countertops. He wasn't looking for distractions, not right now. You didn't have time to think, to feel, and he had. Something that made him stand a little taller, even if only for a moment. He wasn't sure what to believe in, how to believe in it. It wasn't a loud revelation. It wasn't a dramatic moment of clarity. It was subtle, almost like a whisper, but it had settled deep within him, as if it had always been there, waiting for him to listen. He wasn't going to let the slights of others define him. The world might keep knocking him down, but he didn't have to stay there. He made his coffee, the steam rising gently from the cup, and sat by the window, staring out at the city he knew so well. But for him, today felt different. It was as if something had softened them, just a little. It wasn't gone, not entirely. It would never be completely gone. He could carry it without letting it break him. He took a deep breath, the warm cup of coffee steadying his hands. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he didn't need to fix everything. He just needed to keep going, one step at a time. He would face the same challenges today, the same struggles, the same injustices. He wasn't sure how, but he knew there was something more out there, something that had whispered to him in the night, something that had given him the strength to stand up, even when everything in the world was telling him to stay down. And that was enough for now. The wind against his face felt different today, cooler, softer, as though the world itself had made room for him, if only for a moment. It wasn't a miracle, but it was enough. He had long since learned that the physical discomfort was just a part of the job, something that came with the territory. That was what made the work feel unbearable at times. It felt like the smallest victory. The stairwell was narrow, the air stale with the smell of old carpet and dust. The tenants were always different, but the expressions were the same, averted gazes. He didn't expect anything different today. The man who opened it was older, probably in his 60s, his face lined with years of hard living. It was the same as it had always been. He wasn't sure why, but something inside him had shifted. Not as much, anyway. There would be more doors slammed in his face today, but they didn't feel as sharp today. His next stop was a small corner store, a place he had been to many times before. Marcus handed him the package, his gaze meeting the man's for just a moment. Today, it didn't sting. He had faced the same coldness as always, but it hadn't broken him. He had been prepared for it, but somehow it didn't hurt as much. He didn't rush through them with the same sense of dread. There was a quiet strength in him, something that made him stand a little taller with every knock on the door, every package handed over. Even when the world acted like he was. It was something in him, something that had been awakened, something that had shifted. The last delivery of the day was at a large house on the outskirts of the city. It was a different world from the one he usually moved through, but as he rang the doorbell, there was a sense of peace inside him that hadn't been there before. She smiled, not with the practiced politeness of most customers, but with a warmth that caught him off guard. Marcus handed her the package, and for the first time that day, he felt truly seen. She wasn't judging him. She was simply acknowledging him, acknowledging his presence. Enough to remind him that there was more to life than the rejection, the humiliation, and the isolation. There was still room for him to exist. He left the house, his heart lighter than it had been in a long time. He wasn't going to let the coldness of others define him anymore. The air was different tonight, but tonight Marcus didn't mind it as much. He had faced the same struggles, the same dismissive glances, but he didn't feel like he had been broken. The bike creaked beneath him as he rode through the quiet streets. His legs still sore from the long hours, but they were no longer his focus. They weren't the ones filled with bitterness and self-doubt. Tonight, something had shifted. He hadn't expected much when he had walked into the small corner store earlier, but the man behind the counter had greeted him with a nod, a simple acknowledgement that didn't seem like much, but it was enough. And though it hadn't been much, it was enough to remind him that not everyone was quick to judge. Not everyone saw him as invisible. Marcus pedaled past the familiar sights, the run-down buildings, the cracked sidewalks, the faded signs. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He didn't feel as small anymore. The night was still. Young, but Marcus wasn't eager to go inside. But that's where he was supposed to be. He dragged his bike up the stairs, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He wasn't sure how long it would last, but for now, he didn't feel the weight of the world pressing down on him as heavily. As he sat down on the couch, he found himself thinking back to that brief moment in the woman's house, the smile she had given him, like he mattered, even if only for a moment. She didn't see him as the delivery worker or the black man on a bike. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Marcus leaned back, letting out a deep breath. The weight of the day had lifted, if only for a moment. But tonight, he had something to hold on to. The world may have been hard, but it wasn't without its moments of grace. He didn't move right away. The world outside was waiting. But something inside him was different today. It was still there, lurking in the background, but it didn't feel like it was going to consume him. Maybe not tomorrow either. They weren't much, not compared to the weight of the world he carried every day, but they had meant something. As he prepared for the day ahead, Marcus found himself thinking about his work differently. He had never thought about it as anything more than that. He was still the delivery man, still the one who carried packages from one place to another, but for the first time, it didn't feel like the totality of who he was. He dressed quickly, gathering his things, and headed out the door. The streets were quieter than usual, the hum of traffic distant and muted. Marcus rode his bike down the familiar route, the sound of the tires against the pavement, a constant, soothing rhythm. It was the kind of burn that reminded him he was alive, that he was pushing forward, even if the world around him seemed to push back. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything looked the same: small lawns, white picket fences, children playing on the sidewalks. But he had learned long ago to leave the differences at the door. He had to do his job, and that was all. The woman on the other side was older, her hair graying, her face lined with years of life. "Delivery?" she asked, her voice soft. The last time he had lingered, it hadn't ended well. She smiled at him, genuine, warm, and it caught him off guard. It wasn't much, just a simple exchange, but for some reason, it meant more today. Marcus stood there for a moment, staring at the door after she had closed it, the weight of her kindness settling into his chest. He wasn't used to it. It was about how he had been able to take them in, how he had been able to accept them without the usual defense mechanisms kicking in, without the usual wall of indifference. The day continued, and Marcus made his deliveries, but they didn't feel the same as they had before. The world outside hadn't changed. But today, he didn't feel as invisible. It was something in him, something that had shifted. The weight of the world was still there, The injustice, the prejudice, the rejection, they were all still part of his life. He could carry them, yes, but he didn't have to let them break him. It had meant more than he could explain. A quiet reminder that he wasn't alone in the world even when it felt that way. The world wasn't perfect, but tonight he knew one thing. He mattered. It was late, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around him like a heavy cloak. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting, there lost in his thoughts, but his mind was heavy with a strange kind of peace. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that his ability to carry the world had. There was a stillness inside him, a quiet strength that felt new, like something he had found, but wasn't sure how to hold on to. He could hear the hum of the city beyond his apartment, the distant sound of people laughing, cars rushing, by the usual noise that was ever present in the background of his life. Tonight he was just here, alive. The woman's smile, the brief acknowledgement from the man in the store, it wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it had meant everything. And while the world hadn't changed, he had. It was still there, deep in the corners of his soul, but it no longer felt like an open wound. Marcus closed his eyes and leaned back in the chair, the weight of the day finally beginning to catch up with him. But today there was something else, the quiet strength that he could feel deep in his bones. He knew that. But tonight, it didn't feel as heavy. There was still kindness. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath fill his chest, then release into the still air. There was no sudden, miraculous change, that he could keep going, even when it felt like the world was pushing him down. The lights from the street below flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. For the first time in a long time, Marcus didn't feel like a stranger to the world. He mattered. He took a deep breath and smiled to himself, the weight of the day finally starting to fade. For tonight, he could be at peace with who he was. The sun had barely risen, but Marcus was already on the streets. The world was quiet except for the occasional sound of cars passing, the distant rush of life waiting to begin. He had learned to embrace the silence. The hours of riding, of making deliveries, had a way of making everything else fade away. When he was moving, there was only the next street, the next door, the next package. The familiar ache in his legs was still there, the fatigue from the long hours he had worked the day before. But today, it wasn't all-consuming. He wasn't drowning in the heaviness of the world. They weren't much, but they were everything. As he made his way toward the first stop of the day, he thought about the people he would encounter, their dismissive glances, the doors that would be slammed in his face. But something had changed in him. He could still feel it, of course, but now it didn't break him. When he arrived at the first house, the sun was higher in the sky now, the light spilling onto the front porch. The door opened, and the woman on the other side barely looked at him before reaching out to take the package. Marcus stood there for a moment, his hand still lingering in the air where the package had been. It wasn't anything new, but today, he didn't feel the usual weight of it pressing on him. He didn't feel invisible. It was still there, but it didn't define him today. Today, he wasn't going to let it sink into his soul. As he rode through the streets, he found himself noticing the little things. It was as though the world had suddenly opened up to him, as though he had been too focused on the hurt to see the beauty all around him. The same door, the same elevator, the same hallway. But today, he didn't feel burdened by it. The man at the door took the package without a word, as expected. But there was a moment, a brief flicker of something in his eyes, something different. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Even when the world didn't stop to acknowledge him, there were moments of connection, however small, that made the weight of it all easier to carry. The same doors closed, the same dismissive glances. He wasn't drowning in the indifference. Today, the world seemed just a little bit more manageable. The streets were quieter now, the bustle of the day fading into the calm of evening. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion that filled him. He had learned something important today. He had learned to stop letting the world define his worth. And though the battle was far from over, he now knew he could fight it on his terms. The city outside hadn't changed, but Marcus had. The night wrapped around Marcus like a familiar coat, though tonight it felt a little less heavy. The smell of the stale air mixed with the faint scent of his empty coffee cup, the only thing left from the morning. The weight of the day, the deliveries, the dismissals, the cold looks had been different today. The quiet strength that had slowly built inside him was still there, like a soft current running beneath everything he did. He could still feel the sting of rejection, the way people treated him as though he were nothing more than a cog in the machine, someone to pass by without a thought. Get a real job, boy. But the difference today was that it didn't hurt as much. The sting was always going to be there, but now he was learning how to carry it without letting it crush him. He had nothing to prove to a world that refused to see him. The exhaustion was there, but it wasn't the kind that kept him awake at night. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He was more than the job. He was more than the invisible man on a bike, delivering packages from one door to the next. The lights twinkled, casting their reflections onto the streets below. It felt like he was looking at the city for the first time, not as a stranger, not as someone who was just passing through, but as someone who was part of it. The thought settled in his chest with a strange kind of relief. What mattered was that he saw himself. The world could be as cruel as it wanted, and that was enough. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from running away from the world, but the kind that came from facing it head-on, from learning how to carry the weight without letting it break him. He was still the one who had to ride through the streets, who had to deal with the insults, the coldness. The world was still the same, but Marcus wasn't the same. And that was what mattered. The same doors would slam in his face, the same cruel words would be spoken. Tomorrow he would remember that he was more than the job, more than the world's rejection. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to carry the weight without letting it break him. He hadn't slept much, but it didn't matter. The routine had a way of wearing him down, but it also gave him something steady to hold on to. Today, however, he didn't feel the same pull of exhaustion, the same sense of dread that often followed him out the door. His legs still ached, and his back still protested when he moved, but there was something lighter about the way he carried himself today. As he dressed and gathered his things, Marcus thought about the past few days, how the weight of the world hadn't felt as heavy, how the sting of rejection hadn't cut as deeply. They weren't enough to erase the cruelty he faced daily, but they had opened a door inside him. He wasn't sure what to call it, this change. It wasn't an epiphany. For the first time he felt like he was standing in his own life, not just moving through it. He was more than that. The streets were quieter than usual, the city still waking up. The sounds of the city were still the same, but today it felt different. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just surviving the day. The first delivery was a house he had been to many times before. The woman who answered the door was the same as always, distracted, impatient, ready to move on with her day. The door slammed shut without another word. He didn't feel the old familiar ache in his chest, the feeling of being unwanted, unworthy. He was still the same delivery man, but he didn't see himself the same anymore. But with each one, Marcus felt the weight of it lessen just a little. It didn't bury him like it once did. He was learning that he didn't have to carry the world's rejection inside him. He could let it go, just a little. He could let the moments of kindness, however small, shape his day. He felt tired, of course, but there was a quiet sense of peace settling over him. The house he approached was on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that felt like a world of its own. She didn't look at him with the usual cold indifference. "Thank you for bringing this," she said, her voice warm. "You're welcome," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing a little. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a simple thank you. It was everything. He had carried it, yes, but he hadn't let it crush him, and that in itself was a victory. The doors would still slam, the faces would still be cold. He could let it go, piece by piece, and fill the emptiness with something else, something stronger. The city hummed beneath him as Marcus pedaled down the familiar streets, but for Marcus, today felt different. But they didn't weigh him down as they once had. He wasn't invisible. And it wasn't because the world had suddenly changed. The sting of rejection still lingered, but it didn't burn as deeply. He was still the same man. Still the one riding his bike through the streets. Still the one making deliveries. He would rise. Marcus rode through the familiar neighborhood, the streets lined with houses that had seen better days. He had learned that the world didn't owe him kindness, didn't owe him anything. He reached the next house on his route. He rang the doorbell and waited, the weight of the package in his hands, the familiar ache in his legs. He didn't smile, didn't say anything kind, but something was different. He didn't let it define him. It wasn't that the rejection didn't hurt. It still stung. It didn't rob him of his sense of self. For the first time in a long time, he understood that the world's cruelty was not a reflection of his worth. It wasn't the kind of strength that came from fighting back or proving people wrong. He didn't need to change the world and how he saw himself. But with each delivery, with each interaction, the weight of the world felt just a little lighter. The injustice was still there, but Marcus had learned how to carry it without letting it crush him. The woman who answered the door was older, her face gentle but tired, her eyes kind. She didn't avoid his gaze. "Thank you for bringing this," she said, her voice warm. He had expected nothing, but this time the woman saw him, and that was enough. "You're welcome," Marcus said, his voice steady, his heart full. The world hadn't changed, but he had found something more. It didn't matter if the world saw him or not. He had seen the strength in himself that he had been searching for all these years. He had learned to live, truly live, in a world that often wanted him to remain invisible. But he was no longer fighting alone. He had found something inside himself, something that made him stand taller, something that made him believe that justice, even if it came slowly, would eventually find him. He would keep delivering, and this time he wouldn't let the world define who he was, and it would carry him through whatever came next.